All right. So last week, I sat down with Viktor from Marginalia.nu. It's a search engine that he built ostensibly from scratch, meaning the things that actually make it the search engine, he has built from the ground up, and he makes all of the decisions with regards to servers and all of those things, right? He has developed this from a holistic perspective, let's say, right? So the whole thing, thinking about the storage media to use and so on, how that actually works with the code he has and so on. It's a very interesting project, and I actually urge you to also go and use the actual search engine, because it gives, we talk about this in the interview, of course, but it gives results that are different, let's say, than Google. You can find a lot of high information sources, in my opinion. I would say go and use it and see, search for something that you're interested in finding blog posts about, for example, rich on information, maybe technical blog posts, for example. I would say that that's an area where Marginalia actually works out better than the other search engines for me so far. I can say that this would have been invaluable at some point when I was looking into certain things. And so, yeah, this is a conversation between Viktor and I, about sort of the act of writing your own thing in some sense, right? In a broader sense. It's not very technical. If you do want to see more technical content about, for example, search engines, I would love to have Viktor come in and sort of explain some part of, let's say, some basics about what a search engine actually means, right? Possibly, it's obviously it's up to Viktor if he wants to do that, but I certainly think it would be a reasonable idea to do, right? Because it's interesting to learn these things, right? So, yeah, with that said, here's the interview. I hope you like it. It's very long, but it's there's lots to talk about in the end. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope to bring you more interviews with people who are doing interesting things as well. So, with that said, let's go. All right. So, welcome, Viktor, to the channel. This is Viktor Löfgren. He's from, he's the creator of Marginalia. Is that how you would say this in English?
Yeah, Marginalia, but I permit any pronunciation of the word. I'm letting the users dictate what it's called. It's easier that way.
Yeah, and in Swedish, of course, it's Marginalia, which is a really, really great name, by the way. I suggest everyone just use that version, to be honest. It just sounds great. So, Marginalia is a search engine, right? Primarily.
Originally, it was just my blog, but it spiraled out of control, and now it's mostly a search engine.
Right. This is a great way to you built a brand, and then you built a thing around the brand, and it became the brand, right? This is really neat. So, back in 2021, winter, you decided to, in some ways, make yourself heard to the greater internet, so to speak, in a post called The Astrolab Part 1 Lenscraft, which is, of course, by the way, I'm assuming you read a lot of books. You write very poetically, and so on.
Yeah, I do enjoy my reading, and I think I was reading more back then than I am right now. But
right, you're busy now.
Yeah. I'm too busy working to be reading now. So.
Right, and so in this post, you talk about how, first of all, there's a great kind of detail in the first paragraphs that I at least see there, that I wonder if in some ways you intended for it to be there. You describe the internet as a vast and unimaginably vast thing, right? And I get this distinct feeling that there's almost something Lovecraftian about this, right? We're talking almost about one of the old ones, right? If we saw it, we wouldn't even know that we saw it. Like, it's just so huge and unimaginable, awesome in the much grander sense of things, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is, I think this is something that a lot of people aren't really understanding, that they're seeing a mediated version of the web. They're seeing it through, say, a search engine or Reddit or something, and they're selecting slices for you to perceive. But
Right.
the internet as it is much larger than that. And like, even if you visit a new website every day, or 100 new websites every day, then you will never have time to visit them all in a human lifetime. So it's very, very large.
Right. And there's a great detail here in the title. Of course, you put it there for a reason. Lens craft, like crafting lenses, the viewing
Yeah.
of this unimaginably big thing through lenses, because you simply have to, right? We have to view something through some kind of medium that allows it to
Yeah.
be viewed, right? Because we can't see the whole thing. We can't even, we wouldn't be able to even see that we're seeing the whole thing, right? So we use these lenses, right? And you make the point in this post that there's a common sentiment on the small web that the internet has changed somehow. It isn't what it used to be. It's too commercial. There are too many ads. Nobody's being authentic. Pages take forever to load. The blogosphere is dead. There's no substance anymore. Just pictures and hot air and variations on this theme. Right, and this we know from being on the internet. This is a common kind of feeling, right? There's a sense here, right? The zeitgeist, if you will. But you pose quite a different conclusion that I think is very interesting to this, right? And it has to do with these lenses, right? So maybe it's not the internet that has changed, but the lenses you're viewing it through. Google has changed, Reddit has changed, and Facebook has changed. Maybe the internet has changed too, but what if it hasn't? What if it's still out there? And of course, you make the point here that Google, of course, being basically an ad company, an advertisement company, they have incentives to simply change the lens so that it's making them more money, right?
Yeah.
So there's a follow-up here, right? First of all, I mean, I'm assuming you still believe this. It's fairly simply correct if we're being completely honest. But do you have any thoughts on this, like later, 2 years later?
Yeah, I'm a bit surprised I wrote that already back then, because it's something I've been thinking about fairly recently as well. Um, and it's very easy to just jump to the conclusion that the internet has changed, and a lot of people they're doing this all the time. They're like declaring that, well, obviously it's SEO that's the problem, or it's, you know, capitalism, or it's something else, some explanation model. It's all bots, or it's all AI spam or something. But it's incredibly difficult to actually demonstrate this is true, and I think we're permitting yourself to be lazy and not verify, and just take this for granted. Of course, it's SEO that's the problem, and of course it's, you know, capitalism or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, and you can also approach it from like a philosophical angle. Like what if Google decided to remove all websites with dogs or something, and Facebook did the same, and so on? How would we perceive this? Like, it would seem as though dogs went missing from the internet, or possibly, depending on how often you go outside and touch grass, from reality, right? It
Right.
would be like everyone is hating dogs now. It's like a cat world or something.
Yeah.
So this is a really difficult challenge with how we interact with the world in general, especially now that we're so glued to smartphones and so on, that if you change the filtering, then you will make things appear different. And it's a fairly stark contrast as well, if you like, if you're getting your news from Twitter or so on, and everything seems like there's a conflict, and there's fighting, and nobody's getting along, and then you go outside, and it just seems completely different, and then all this like fire and conflict is just vanished.
Yeah.
So this is a pretty strong effect that it's difficult to even like touch on, because it's so close to us. And everything we interact with is filtered through this in some way or another.
Right. And it's interesting, right? Because this post begs the question, right? Shouldn't we all have our own lens then, right? Shouldn't we all kind of construct our own lens, if only to be aware of the lens that we are seeing things through, right? There's almost like a philosophical idea here about, if I'm at least aware of my biases that I have created through my lens, like I might be able to see them more clearly. I might be able to remove them or otherwise manipulate them somehow. I doubt that anyone wants to be like, oh yeah, I will certainly cultivate a undesirable trait by having this lens. Let's go for it, right? Or whatever, right? But we know that there are parts of the internet where you end up in a bubble. You end up having a skewed view of the world, certainly. And everyone else can see that, but you cannot because you're in the bubble. Like, you know, and this happens, of course, in trivial contexts like, well, I think Rust is more popular than it is. Or, you know, other things that we might believe on Hacker News, for example. Or some other site like this that celebrates this kind of, let's say, more, I want to say modern, but it's not really modern, but you get what I'm saying, right? We live in bubbles. In large parts on the internet, these kind of big communities tend to bubble up in some ways, right? And we form ideas about the world. But if we were aware of the lens, by, for example, constructing our own search engine, do you think that this would, in some ways, mitigate or otherwise change the perspective?
Yeah, I think the impact of these distortions of reality or of the web in general, it's largely made possible by having such few aggregators or discovery mechanisms or search engines or whatever. If you have like one or two big algorithms that selects what people are seeing, then it's very easy to end up in a very, very filtered view of the world, right? But the more alternatives there are, the easier it is to discover that actually if I view it from this angle, it looks completely different, and you get this like almost jarring contrast of, well, why does this seem true when I use Twitter, or why does this only seem true when I use Facebook? So I think the way to combat this is just to have more discovery mechanisms and more ways of viewing the web in general, and that's sort of the mission I embarked on when I started thinking about this. That, well, if I can at least show that this is happening, then it will be easier to approach it in some way.
Right. Did you have at any point the idea of kind of, this is obviously a big word maybe, but democratizing search engines in some ways? Or was it simply, I want to provide one alternative? Or was there an idea that, well, at the very least, I can show that just one person can do this? And you had the very audacious idea in some ways to run this on a Raspberry Pi at one point. And this did not necessarily happen, but you then decided, I will run it on commodity hardware in my living room. So we decided to kind of step up a little bit, but certainly there's something a little bit, you know, I can do this, you can do this, that I'm extracting this from what you're saying at the very least in these posts.
Yeah, so I mean, at some point I just did the numbers on a napkin, and I couldn't figure out why the heck I couldn't run this on a bunch of Raspberry Pis, because like the data doesn't seem to be all that big. It's like I don't remember exactly what I was aiming for when I had my Pi cluster, but I think it was like a couple of 100 billions of documents, and this seems like, well, this should fit in a couple of 100 gigabytes, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't do this. And when you get that sort of a, well, the numbers say this, and my intuition says I need a data center, then I mean you need to try, right? And I quickly discovered that actually you can't run a search engine on a bunch of Raspberry Pis, which perhaps shouldn't be surprising, but I discovered that actually you can sort of run the search engine on low-powered hardware,
Right.
and I don't know if if the mission has ever been to democratize it so much as just demonstrate what's possible and have other people try as well.
Right.
Because I think in general, hardware has gotten like absurdly powerful the last couple of years, and there's a lot of focus on AI nowadays, but I think it's sort of clouding the advances in processors in general, and this is a big part in why AI is moving so fast as well. GPUs are super powerful, and CPUs are super powerful, and storage media, they're big and they're fast and all that stuff. So a lot of stuff that required a data center 10 or 20 years ago, you can do it on a PC nowadays. And I've actually moved away from my living room server now, so I'm on a proper server. But
describe what proper means.
Well, it's enterprise hardware, and it's like 500 gigabytes of RAM and all that stuff. But this was like 2-3 months ago. I was granted some money from a nice organization in Texas that wanted to frustrate the efforts of Google and so on.
Right. Did you feel at any point actually that this limitation? I don't know if you have ever seen it as a limitation. To be fair, the commodity hardware. Have you at any point seen this as a limitation? Was there a point where you were like, "Man, I'm just running on this PC," and
Yeah, I think very recently it's become a limitation. And just when I moved to a bigger server, it started to get really awkward to actually, I need to move this file over to this physical drive because it doesn't quite fit on this drive, and there's like all this juggling to make it work.
But it took 2 years. Basically.
Yeah, it took 2 years, and I was like at 100 million documents at that point, and I mean, I could probably have optimized it a bit further, but there's actually a point to running on low-powered hardware as well, which is that you run into scaling problems much faster, and especially when I was like running on Pies, if you build an algorithm that's dumb or inefficient, you will discover it immediately.
Right.
Whereas if I had like this monstrous server I'm running on now, from the beginning, I would not have discovered any scaling issues until much later, and then they would be very difficult to solve. So it can be a bit beneficial to target these low-powered devices from the start, I think.
You actually answered my follow-up question brilliantly, entirely by yourself there. So. Yeah, I was going to ask, like, was this at any point, this kind of leanness, right? Is it a motivator in some ways to simply do a better job, right? And I think you said it fairly clearly. It will help you find the pieces that this is not good enough, certainly faster.
Yeah. Yeah, and to add to that, I think in general, when you're doing something like this, you're constantly looking for ways of being more efficient and more scrappy and using the resources you have available, both like hardware resources and developer resources, time and so on. Like how can I put this to good use in a way that I think if you're developing professionally with a huge budget, or maybe a venture capitalist or something is throwing money at you, then you will not be as scrappy, and you will. I think you will discover your problems later in many ways.
Right. Yeah, you tend to run into different scaling problems, certainly in those cases where you're now scaling on outside of the program in so many ways, and so on.
Yeah.
On that topic, there's a follow-up kind of post somewhere in between a few key posts here that's called the system upgrade, which is in some ways like has a double meaning. To me, it has a double meaning. Because of course you're talking here about actually upgrading your server, or talking about the hardware and so on. You've invested at some point in a Optane 900 for, I think it was random access, was supposed to be better with this. Is that correct?
Yeah, Intel had a line of very fancy hard drives for a while that used some it's like an SSD, but not quite. So
Right.
you get much better like sustained write performance than the normal SSD. So I was running that for a while.
Did this work out?
I don't know. It's really difficult to benchmark and so on. But I was running a part of the system is a SQL database that contains a bunch of links and so on.
Right.
This isn't very central to the search engine. Most of the actually search happens outside of the SQL database, but this was on this Optane drive. But the problem is just that first of all, they are out of production, and I think I got one of the last ones that was available from some shady Amazon guy. And the other problem is that they're stupidly expensive and they're kind of small.
Right.
So I think probably shooting myself in the foot a bit by going for this. I should probably have just gotten some enterprise SSD instead, because they are much better than consumer SSDs. And you can actually, if it's like the proper protocol, you can just insert them into a consumer machine, no problem.
Right. How are they better, actually? I'm curious now. Are they better in terms of access, like read access times? How is it reliability?
They all of the above. They're like better across all axes, and they're not all that much more expensive. So,
All right.
but I think in general, most users of SSDs aren't really saturating them in any way. I mean, if you're like loading stuff off Steam or something, like the search engine work I do is very disk intensive, and I'm like doing sustained writes for hours on end, and so I'm pushing the hardware a lot harder than I think the average user, and like I have never like casually worn out an SSD before, but I had like a consumer SSD in this PC server I had that I think I wore down like 80% of the wear in 6 months or something.
Wow. Yeah.
Which is really. But I was doing some really suboptimal write patterns on this as well, so it was really sort of chewing through the wear of the server.
Right.
Of this drive.
Like you said, though, you found this simply because if you run on commodity hardware, like for just normal people, you find these kinds of issues much easier, right? You had to essentially do something better in order to get away from this kind of pattern. This is very interesting, right? There's another meaning to this post that I'm at least getting. In some ways, you upgraded your development life, is how I'm going to interpret this. You talk in this post about how you used a myriad of tools initially that ended up, in some ways, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it, they ended up using you in some ways, right? They're effectively eating your time. They're eating your resources on your computer. You ended up having half of the RAM left for your actual application and so on. And we're not going to name these, of course, but I will read some of these interesting quotes from the post because I do find them very interesting, right? There's one that I find very poignant, and it will be relevant as long as we live, probably. Everyone talks about what is suitable for production, but everything keeps inexplicably breaking. Nothing is ever easy to fix, and the solution is always some inexplicable snippet on Stack Overflow you're just supposed to blindly run without really understanding. And this, I think, is an indictment of our entire industry. Certainly the one that I believe we have been part of, us two specifically, which is backend services and so on, has a rich history, let's call it, of overcomplicating things. Let's put it like it is, right? We are currently in the midst of effectively making Kubernetes the industry standard. You do talk briefly about Kubernetes in this post. What is your view on this? Because this was approximately 2 years ago. What is your view here on this now, in the context of the search engine?
I think I'm a bit less dogmatic than I was back then, but I'm still very much leaning toward. I want to understand the tools that I use and try to use as simple tools as possible. And sometimes you discover that actually maybe containerization is in the current state of the search engine, now that I'm running on a bigger server and I have like a partitioned index and so on, I have like 24 processes that I need to spawn. Maybe I can't like run systemd or something like that. That's suddenly become too awkward and cumbersome. But I think at the point that you are, however complicated your application is, or it's usually a good idea to keep it as simple as possible and at least understand why you would need this, because there's so much like blog post driven architecture nowadays when someone is starting a new project and they're like, okay, what's popular now, let's go with Kubernetes or whatever, and what they're building is a blog or a to-do app or something like that really doesn't benefit from this, and I don't think it's ever a good reason to do something simply because it's popular or considered professional or something like that. You always need to scrutinize those claims, because a lot of this discussion it's poisoned by marketing, right?
Right.
And like in general, I've been programming for almost 30 years, and I've been programming professionally for something like 15 now. And I've seen in the course of my lifetime, I've seen maybe, I don't know, 15 major projects, and that's not actually a lot of data points to draw conclusions about development practices on. So most of how I understand what's a good development practice is something I've just heard, and this is, I think, almost universally true. But all these rules and all these practices, they're like situationally valid. There are cases where actually you can ignore this rule and you can do something simpler. Or and I think this is a really difficult landscape to navigate. In part because, as I mentioned, there's so much marketing going on that's like injected into this discussion about best practices and so on. You need to run a cloud service, and you need to use this service, and you need to do that, and you need to do like scaled agile or whatever. And all of that is coming from marketing. And right. On the other hand, you have all these developers who have what they're seeing is discussion has all this like poison injected into it, so it very quickly becomes common consensus that actually you need to use K3S, and you need to use Helm, and you need to do this, and you need to do that, and I don't think a lot of people can answer like, when is this true? Is it always true? And this is something I'm like trying to always be aware of and challenge a bit.
Right.
And sometimes you discover that actually, containerization is great for this use case, or it sucks for this use case, or whatever. And it's a matter of like scrutinizing it and finding out rather than just harvesting the blogs and looking for what other people are doing.
Yeah, in some ways, like you said, the conversation is muddled by the fact that we tend to do this we have these, in some ways, oral traditions amongst engineers that constantly evolves, right? Where we call them industry best practices, but what it is a story told by one person to another, sometimes one company to many people, and we don't make a difference between these, generally speaking. We instead take people at their word, and generally speaking, because like you said, none of us actually have enough data points to say anything necessarily conclusive about any of these things, right? We do in fact not run the cloud services that actually stuff is hosted on and so on. We can't actually talk about those scales and so on. And I think the lack of nuance, right? The lack of nuance in this discussion is entirely the problem, because as you said, some of these have valid cases, right? Certainly, right? They are there. They were invented for a reason, right? And just as everything that is invented for a reason, there's a use case for it. Maybe it's not the best solution, but maybe it's a good solution to a problem regardless, right? And so it's not necessarily that these things are bad, right? But it's certainly the case that adopting them without thinking about why you would is maybe the actual problem, right? So we have ended up in a situation where many systems start out with Kubernetes. And that is perhaps the biggest misstep in all of this, to say, well, we can't possibly have something that doesn't run with Kubernetes, right? But we have to take shortcuts in this process, because as we established, we don't know everything. We can't actually conclusively say everything about a project and so on. So the shortcuts end up being the way we do things. But some of these shortcuts are very short. Let's put it like that.
Yeah.
I think this post is very interesting, right? Because it touches on scale. You do touch on scale in this post. I did not quote that, but you talked about your own scale and how clearly I do not need most of the stuff I'm currently using to do what I'm doing, and so on. But then you have grown into certainly appreciating some of the things that you were previously using to some extent, right? And that is exactly the trajectory I would expect for let's say a well-reasoned architecture to take. Like, the trajectory here is clear. We scale up into perhaps a bit more complex solutions, right? So I think in some ways you were in some ways your own prophet, I would say, in this post. Except you probably, because you called yourself dogmatic, did you have this feeling of, oh, no, screw everything, because I feel like there was a nuance here hidden behind everything still. You were talking about scale. You were talking about clearly, like, this cannot be the case. Like, I should not need Kubernetes. I'm wasting half my RAM, and so on.
Yeah. I think when I started out in this project, I had very strong feelings that maybe these things are never necessary and we're just complicating things. But I think I have more nuance to that now. And this is, I think you should probably like approach things by making a statement. I think this is true, but then you should evaluate it. Does this hold? And then you should keep re-evaluating what you think and what you believe. And
right.
So starting from a very strong standpoint, actually we should just run everything on like native Debian or something. I've come to like add stuff to it as I've gone along and discovered that actually this is quite a lot of work, and maybe I can simplify it by doing this or doing that. And I think that's something that everyone should do, like regarding almost anything, because and this is just how you learn as well. I think in general, like, whether you're learning to play the guitar or you're learning programming, you usually start out being very rules driven, and you see this a lot in programming as well. Like that guy who has read clean code and now they're like evangelizing line methods and so on, and then they discover that actually now that I have the option to build my own project and I apply all these rules, but it turns out what I built was kind of crap, and then you run into this like you find data points where all these rules are followed and that it doesn't lead to what you expected. Or you
right.
find someone has built something like in flagrant disregard of all your rules and it's still amazing. And so you're forced to confront that actually this isn't always valid. And that's how you get better at anything, right? You
right.
learn when you can bend the rules and how much you can bend the rules. And the way to do that is to bend the rules and see what breaks and how it breaks.
Right. Explore yourself.
This is Yeah, and this is obviously more difficult in a professional setting than is in your own projects, right? But I think it's essential to actually like get a deeper understanding of anything.
Yeah, this is a very good point, right? Exploring those boundaries that you've in some ways have set for you, because that's kind of how, like you said, like we take rules from external sources and constrain ourselves to those rules, either knowingly or unknowingly. It might be we get reviews that say we should do this and so on, and taking that and saying, well, what is the limitation to that? Right? Where is it actually fine to not do that? Is there a point to that rule at all? Is it doing for me what they are telling me it's supposed to be doing? I think that's also an interesting kind of thought, because a lot of the stuff is in some ways gospel. That's where we, in some ways, all of our criticisms of this entire space of things is, I guess, driven by, because we call it gospel, we say that you're dogmatic, etc. It strikes me as we are aware that we are preaching to each other a large part of the time, and we treat this conversation exactly as that, which is interesting because we never seem to learn from our own terminology about these things either. There's one thing you bring up in this post, still the system upgrade, an insight about tools that I think is very poignant still. So bear with me, this is going to be a long quote, everyone. The complexity of working with a solution like Kubernetes can only be handled using a tool like Kubernetes. In the small domain, such automation creates more work, not less. This abstraction is a complication rather than a simplification, if the concrete isn't already very complicated. You have logs across dozens of containers, so you can't grep them anymore. So you need Elasticsearch and Fluentd. But raw Elasticsearch is a headache, so you need Kibana too. Oh, hey, now it's gotten even more complicated. Can't even see when stuff goes down. Better set up monitoring that alerts you. Let's see, Prometheus is good, but the GUI is nasty. Better get Grafana too. This is how the snowball rolls. Adding things makes the setup more complicated, which mandates adding even more things to deal with the complexity, which makes them more complicated, which ... So there's a feeling here. Like, how do you feel about this now? Of course, like, you have grown a little bit softer on the previous stuff, but do you see this like as a general problem, let's say, out and about?
Yeah, I do think it's fairly common. I should note that I actually run Prometheus and Grafana now, but I run it on a server with 0.5 terabyte of RAM, so it doesn't quite use the same amount of resources as it, like, proportionally as it used before. But yeah, I think it's a problem to start like from the get-go using tools that require all these resources, because it makes, like, whatever you're building, it require all the more resources, and like I think when you're building something simple, keep it simple, because the simpler whatever you're building is, the easier it is to work with, right? And in general, just try to keep things as simple as they can be.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's a good way to... Sorry?
I should also note that I'm basically stealing this sentiment from Thoreau, right? From Walden. So.
Right. I don't. I'll be honest. I don't know which quote that would be, or from what book or concept.
Yeah. He wrote a book about moving to Walden Pond and basically building a cabin and living there, doing the basics. And he made a lot of points about economics and so on, and stating that if you're living off the land, then you're basically doing what you want and doing what you need. But if you're getting cattle, then you're basically working for the cattle. You need to milk them every day, and you need to feed them and so on. So you're doing more work to be able to do less work.
Right.
I'm kind of butchering the sentiment he's making, but I just wanted to note that I'm copying his homework.
Yeah. Obviously, it's an insightful thing. You don't want to take credit for it. I'll give you the credit for just putting it in such a visceral way, because it is, of course, like, reading this, you can sense a dissatisfaction, a certain stressor here. You do note, actually, I should be fair, you do note in the post that Prometheus is good. It's, a good thing, but it's here mostly because it's part of a larger system of self-perpetuating system of things, let's say, right? Because that is what the concept is in some ways about. Design that in some ways perpetuates itself, right? we see this all over the place. Like we have languages that have features that are there to make up for features that the languages have. We have design patterns that are there to make up for the steps that we have taken in using the language a certain way, and so on, right? Certain patterns that are supposed to mitigate what we're telling ourselves we need to do with this language, for example, and so on and so forth, right? This is a very common trait. Do you have any kind of, do you notice this out in the wild and try to tell yourself, hey, I had better not get into this? This seems like the kind of thing that has this Ouroboros-like structure where it's eating itself and continuing forever. Like I could go too deep into this. Do you ever feel this when you look at software, when you look at solutions for architecture and so on? Like, is this something you have sort of internalized now as with a radar of some kind, or?
I don't know. I think you need to be fairly deeply into something to discover these patterns. But I think like the best example is the one we're discussing right now, where I mean there's no small way of running Kubernetes, because you're getting all this stuff by necessity.
Right. So in some ways,
but there's also a point of like I think going back to what we discussed earlier, like it's easy to fall into these patterns because someone like Netflix is doing it or Google is doing it, and not really thinking about, well, actually, are we Netflix scaled, or are we like for developers? And do we have the sort of needs that they have, and why are they using this?
Right. Yeah. I'm curious mostly because I certainly have no way. You know when you see it that this is a system that I'm continuously paying for with my own time and energy, even though it was supposed to save me a ton of trouble at the end of the day, and so on. So I'm just curious from help me, I'm drowning kind of way. No, but yeah, I do feel like this is a very relevant question, right, in the landscape. I do find that there is a, especially you mentioned before, like new people. I do think that there's a, it's not inconceivable here that we are effectively drowning new people in tools and methodologies that really end up just sort of being a lavine, an avalanche, if you will, of things, when really what they need right now is just like, well, let's build, let's make a snowman. And we don't need all of that other stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And so on.
Yeah, and there's actually a point about like beginner advice as well, which is that, I mean, some blogs and some YouTube channels and so on, they're sort of putting themselves out as a beginner channel, and then they give a bunch of good advice, but then they discover that actually the amount of good advice for beginners is kind of small, and then you see this in a lot of spaces. You see it in like gym channels and stuff like that as well. Like the actual basics, they're fairly limited, but yeah. I mean, you can't stop making blog posts or videos. So what do you make now? You need to like invent new rules and new stuff that everyone needs to know in order to succeed as a beginner. And I don't understand how newcomers to programming are coping with this. I mean, when I started, I had like Kernigan and Ritchie and the man pages, and that was it. And it's such a limited scope that even though like there's a steep learning curve, you couldn't really go wrong because there wasn't any place to get lost. But nowadays, whenever I'm looking at something new, I'm just getting a headache because there's so much information and so much of it's like not very deep. So you get a snippet of information, and then you need to go find some other page, or maybe go into Stack Overflow or something, and piece all this information together. So yeah, I don't understand how people are coping with this.
Yeah,
this may be like an old man yelling at clouds, possibly, but
Yeah, I guess we're two then, because a couple of old men yelling at cloud. I suppose because I made a video specifically actually detailing how I started out, right? And one of the points that I was making in that video that I feel is relevant here is no one owned my learning experience, except me, maybe, right? There was no one to guide it for better or worse. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the guidance nowadays is for the worse. It's based on very poor vehicles for learning, and like you said, they don't necessarily have explanations. Instead, people are told to use React, and that's it, really. Just learn how to do something in React. Don't learn how anything works or how one puts together a system of logic just to have it make sense, for example, and so on. And I think, I think when I look at what someone would have to do now to learn the things that I have, even just the first few years, socket programming and stuff like this. First of all, it's all hidden. Only stodgy old people will tell you that this exists. You're effectively in some ways forced to use some kind of second order thing, right? That doesn't necessarily behave as the let's quote unquote old thing, right? Using BSD sockets in many languages now is behind some kind of mystical interface that is much more like the language itself or whatever it might be, right? And it occludes a lot of what is actually going on, right? I really do feel very strongly that trying to learn what's going on with you within a program is probably incredibly hard nowadays, and that is in part why the channel exists, to be honest, because we don't necessarily talk from a perspective of, oh, here's how this layer on top works, and so on. It's more about, well, how do we build the layer on top if we know how the thing works and so on, and things like this.
Yeah. And there's actually another point, like so much of I mean, FOMO is such a good tool for keeping readers, right, and keeping viewers. You can tell them that unless they're listening to you, then they will learn outdated advice, or they will be made redundant by AI or something, and it's really nasty, and it's poisoning the way people are thinking about technology. Like you must learn React, or you must do this and this and this, and otherwise you will be irrelevant, and that's just not true. But it's really hard, I think, especially as a beginner, to call BS on that.
Well, yeah, you can't, right? Because you even if you have sound reasoning from a logical perspective, let's say, how are you going to approach a big, for example, YouTuber with this critique? They have an army of very willing participants in this process, either experienced or inexperienced, that will tell you you're obviously wrong. Making the 5th My Stack video in 2023, that makes perfect sense. But that is, of course, that's the point of the stack videos, is to bring FOMO to the people, right? Yeah. Basically, now I'm using this stack, and that's because it's the best. I've switched from the previous stack. The previous stack is garbage. Don't look at that. Don't look at the previous. Actually, look at the previous stack videos, but give me the watch time. But don't take it seriously. This is the one true stack. We have upgraded. It's distinctly an upgrade. Trust me. And then, 3 months later, there's a new stack video. Why not? Right? The stack has now gotten even better. When will we reach the top of this mountain? We never will. But we will pretend that we will every time that now we have reached the ultimate stack, guys. I think what you're saying here is that the FOMO is really it's a powerful tool to kind of to attract people, to be honest.
Powerful and destructive.
Yeah. We can only hope that I will stop making videos before I start making shit up, guys. Because once we reach that point, I should definitely do something else with my life. Hopefully I will stay on the right track. So quality in searches, right? We talked about before the act of creating your own lens. And you embarked on creating your own lens, right? You exposed this lens, of course, to other people, but in effect, you were building your own lens. And there were a few things that kind of went into quality. Right? You have this quality score. It's not a judgment on the quality of a web page. It's simply a way to score these web pages to get the most interesting results out, right? One interesting thing, and I wonder if this has remained true, right, is do we still penalize the web pages for having script tags? What is the status of that?
Yeah, I have an upper limit on the number of script tags, but when I originally built this quality metric, I was looking for a very narrow set of websites, which was basically really old school websites. You know, your primordial professor website about lizards or something.
Right.
But I've expanded the scope of the search engine quite a lot. So now I'm actually serving JavaScript websites as well. But I think in general, what I'm doing now is I'm bringing in a lot more components to this. I'm looking at stuff like average sentence length, and I'm looking at stuff like how long is the path of the URL and all of these factors to actually rank the results. And there's like surprising correlation between quality and a whole bunch of these things.
How long is a good URL, if I can ask?
It's short. I think what it captures is blog spam essentially, because a lot of the spammier blogs, they're using WordPress, and so what I'm looking for is like websites with a lot of documents and long paths, and then I'm penalizing them, and it turns out to fairly aggressively remove spammy blogs. But there's a whole bunch of these factors I'm using, and I'm also trying to expose a few of them to the users as well. So I have like filters in the search engine where you can. One of them is actually applying sort of the old logic and just picking up like vintage websites that are built in HTML3 and don't have a lot of script, and then I have like a filter for only searching among academic domains and so on. And I think there's like a pedagogical point to this as well, that actually if you apply different filters, then you will get different results on and so on.
Right. Exposing this to the user makes them aware of, first of all, like there's a lens. You are in some ways changing that lens right now. Think about what you want to see.
Tuning a TV or something.
Right.
Yeah, and there's also points to be made about like user agency and so on. So I'm not like shoving stuff onto the users. I'm giving them more options.
Right. Is this an ad hoc process? Because of course at the beginning, it seemed a lot like an ad hoc process. This tuning of things, and in some ways the way you talk about it now, it seems very ad hoc still.
It's still pretty ad hoc. I'm tuning some parameters, and I'm testing on testing it out, and well, now it looks a bit worse. Now these results aren't promoted as well, so I'm looking at it some more. I'm basically just eyeballing all this stuff. In general, I mean, yeah, you could probably automate this somehow, but it's difficult and requires a lot of work. So I'm doing a surprising amount of this stuff manually, and just ad hoc.
Yeah, you may have noticed I made a face there. My instinctual feeling about you could probably automate a lot of this is, I guess the software maker in me is instinctively saying, please don't. This is a mistake. We're going in the wrong direction here. Now, I ask because ad hoc tweaks. The way I asked that question may or may not have inspired some sense of, hang on, should I be disciplined about this? And it is in fact the opposite that I'm kind of looking for here, right? I find that a system that can be, in some ways, can react to ad hoc changes and so on is, generally speaking, a good system. It means we don't have to have a complicated rule system with rigid structure in order to actually change the system, unless we absolutely want to. But I tend to think that this is somehow... Yeah, I tend to think that this is an over-abstraction in more cases than it is not. So I was looking for sort of, has this evolved in, a more, hey, no, I have a rule engine, for example, right? And it seems like, no, that is definitely not really what's happening.
Well, if you really squint, it's maybe a rule engine, but it's a very ad hoc rule engine.
Right.
So
yeah. In some ways, isn't a program a rule engine? I guess, to be honest,
course,
right?
But I see what you're getting at, and I also think this is probably like a matter of scale as well. If in 15 years this has spiraled even more, and I have like 500 people working on this, and where the European Google or something, maybe at that point it would be necessary to have more abstractions to allow more people to work on the problem. But I think this is like many things, it's a matter of scale. If you have one or a few people, then you don't need to be as rigid about it.
One example of this, I guess, would be where I think maybe they need a rule engine would be, for example, Facebook has a system for filtering spam that is built on top of Haskell, which has a custom executor engine for Haskell code where they can essentially write new rules for what is considered spam and have them be hot reloaded into the system. And it processes, of course, I don't know how many links per second, but it's ridiculous amounts. Maybe they do need that, but then you also have to consider, like, could they get away with something much smaller? To be honest, like we don't really know. We don't work at Facebook, but it is an interesting idea, right? Because this kind of system, they have effectively re-architected how Haskell reloads code and so on. They actually added hot reloading to Haskell in order to accomplish that. And you have to consider at that point, you're doing a lot of work for something. They didn't know what they were doing it for, effectively, in the beginning. I think they were just doing engineering. They thought that was cool. And effectively, they ended up with this system written in Haskell. All right, so we talked about quality, right? And the lens you were creating at some point, right? And how this has evolved. It evolves in an ad hoc fashion, but there's something guiding the creation of the lens, right? There's an end goal. What would you say let's say the archetypical site is that Marginalia wants to serve me, let's say? Or is there a goal that is not necessarily about the archetypical site, but rather preserving a quality of something? Or what are we trying to do with the lens?
I think in general, I don't know if there's like an archetype for the sort of type of site I'm looking for. It's more like I'm trying to offer ways of exploring the internet through like various different axes. And there's like a type of site I'm not interested in, which is basically what you find on Google or on like some other major aggregator.
Right.
I'm basically trying to make available the rest, whatever that is, and what ends up happening is that a lot of what I'm serving is personal websites or non-commercial websites and so on. But I think this is almost like an accidental property.
Right.
On the other hand, like what I'm after is interesting search results, right? Where interesting is a fairly arbitrary word, but interesting to me.
Right.
So,
would you say that maybe it's you talked about Google, right? What Google is trying to do. Is it a fair assessment to say that it is trying to not serve commercial interests for really anyone necessarily. Like, it's trying to focus on content more than any kind of, oh, someone has optimized for selling, for perhaps, and I wanna surface them, their result. Is it fair to say that you're trying to avoid that situation more than anything else?
Yeah, I'm leaning quite a lot toward like the non-commercial side of things. So yeah, that's a fair assessment, I think.
Right. Yeah, as a user, I can say my experience with Marginalia so far is I have a much higher likelihood, I think, of finding a technically insightful blog post on Marginalia about a thing that I'm looking for. I can tell you there are situations where if I had Marginalia back in, for example, 2019, I would know more about which system languages I would want to use, for example, because people have written lots of insightful posts about these, of course, but they get drowned out by, marketing web pages and other things, generally speaking. I would say running that search today, at the very least, yields posts that would have been useful had I, had access to this, right? And I find that, technically insightful posts or, just stuff that is produced by a human being who wants to say something. I think it's actually I get the distinct feeling that I'm getting something that is written by a person that wants to participate on the web. And that's hard to put words to, but this is basically the only way I have of saying it, right? And it reminds me a lot of the early web.
Yeah, exactly. That's fairly close to what I want to capture. Like, because I think the modern web, it's making it feels as though it's really far to other people on the modern web, even though you have like social media and so on, but it's so performative. Whereas as the web from the past was more about active participation and showing what you're doing, and this is someone made a very insightful essay about like we used to say this is my website, and now we say like this is me,
right?
Me on the web, which is very different. Like I can make a website that is mine, but it isn't like a representation of me as a person.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm trying to focus a lot on those types of like more personal websites and so on. I think they are usually fairly interesting. Not all of them are, but many of them are. And just to show how much is out there, because when I started working on this, one of the frustrations I had was it was just so hard to find like interesting websites anymore.
Yeah,
everything is just commercial or like haha funny memes, like pictures of cats or something.
Or a well-groomed profile that follows a pattern that any other thing on that page has to follow, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. So it feels very shallow on that side of the web, and that was something I wanted to see if I could get out of.
Yeah, I don't want to give you too much confidence here, but I think you're doing a great job. I think it's in some ways this is just a lament on my part. In some ways, I had to unlearn in some ways how to search for things again, because I was trying to use Marginalia, right, for stuff, but I guess I didn't really know what I was looking for yet, right? And I found that when I was just looking for interesting things, I got results that I wanted. But it's not the one that I would necessarily use for just like, I just need a quick answer to this question, right? For that, we still have Google, but we might be served some, just some straight up garbage, but we might actually receive the answer and then we skip. Mentally, we've already checked out by the time we read the second result in some ways, right? Oftentimes, I've already mentally checked out of a Google search result when I'm down at like 3, right? Because at that point, it's all unlikely we're going to find whatever we were looking for. And I'm only here for some quick answers. I just don't want to get away from this page as soon as possible. That's how I feel about Google nowadays, right? And with Marginalia, I find is that I can actually go down these and basically open all of them in a new tab. And I have reading to do to a large extent. Is kind of how I feel. And it's a different mode of operation. Like, this is kind of what I have felt as a user, right? Where if I adjust my my way of consuming this information, right, and I use these search engines accordingly, it really gives just a better time, right? And I will say it's easier to learn things. I have found if you use Marginalia for the things that I'm using it for, at least, right? I couldn't use Google like that, I think, nowadays. There may have been a time when we could. That time has passed. Like you said, the lens has changed, right? It's an ad company. They don't want to do these things anymore, and so on. So I think you're doing a great job, and I really just want you to continue doing that, to be honest. Like exactly what you're doing now, even if maybe you might have other stuff on the horizon, of course, but you know, the results are good. Is what I want to say.
Yeah, and it should be stated I'm like actively not trying to do question answering with the search engine, because that's I think especially with ChatGPT and so on, it's a dead end to try to solve that problem. But actually finding interesting documents written by human beings is something that like ChatGPT can't do. It's not a search engine, and what you get isn't written by a human being.
Yeah, it is instead partly made up by a machine in ways you cannot readily identify always. There's so much in that conversation, but we're not going to go there, not right now. So there's an interesting post that you have titled "Creepy Website Similarity," which I think is very straight to the point, and I love it. This title is great because reading this post, so to in some way summarize for the listeners, viewers, whatever, the post is effectively about using cosine similarity to find similarities between the data collected about websites, correct? In your system, effectively, right? We're comparing two vectors to see how similar they are.
It's looking at the similarity between the sets of incoming links to given websites.
Right. Okay. And we have these two paragraphs that I think they get straight to the point, right? Because you figured out effectively that you can map a part of effectively the web using this method of comparing these two things or the space, right? So you can map out effectively, here's that area of the web, correct?
Yeah.
Right. And you say this about it, which is interesting. On the one hand, it's fascinating and cool. On the other, it's deeply troubling. If I can create such a map on a PC in my living room, imagine what might be accomplished with a data center. You might think, well, what's the problem? QAnon deserves all the scrutiny. Give them nowhere to hide. Except this sort of tool could conceivably work just as well for mapping democracy advocates in Hong Kong, Putin critics in Russia, gay people in Uganda, and so forth. And this entire post, in some ways, there's a dilemma here, right? On the one hand, you're detailing something that can certainly be used to do all of these things, and worse, right? On the other, is it in some ways immoral, I wonder, right, to let only the large companies and so on have the know-how and the tools to do these kinds of things, right? There's an interesting kind of thing going on there. How do you feel about this post? Like in retrospect, like did you consider like, hey, should I even be telling people about this and so on? Like, what was it? Sort of, how did you feel about this?
Yeah, exactly. I discovered this was able to do some pretty creepy things, and as you allude to, the big like Facebook and so on, they are definitely doing this, and this is a fairly well documented technique for like correlating data. So the question is, should I publish this? And I sort of landed at yes, I should publish it because it's creepy, because it makes visible what all these like big social media companies are doing, and in some sense democratizes the access to this information. Even though this is, I mean, the tool I have built is fairly blunt, but you can definitely do more stuff with the same basic algorithm on social graphs and so on. I think it's probably important. Like, it's one thing to say like, hey, Facebook is being creepy. They're like analyzing a bunch of data. It's another thing to show them, hey, this is what you can do with a bunch of fairly innocuous data.
Yeah.
I think it's showing has much more impact than telling, and this has always like been my philosophy. I had like a half-built search engine before I told anyone about it, because it's easier to like, if you show someone something, it's harder to deny that this is true than if you're just saying, hey, they're spying on you or they're doing creepy things.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting thing. Obviously, there's the dilemma, right? I come out on one side of this still. I don't think that's the right thing necessarily, but it's just what I suspect is true, right? This idea that it is certainly better for everyone to know exactly what exists. And telling them how to do it means you can demonstrate that this is real. This is not a conspiracy theory. And certainly they have much more intricate things going on. You know, you can imagine that this can be used much more in a much more advanced way, with even more data that they can correlate about people and so on. So I certainly land on one side of this. But the dilemma is interesting, right? There was at some point, I remember on Hacker News, there was a tool someone had made to reconstruct someone's entire presence on the web, effectively, and so on. And this went through the same kind of, you know, there was a dilemma there. This makes it trivial to, I mean, stalk people, for sure. I remember that the author basically elected to go the other way and say, I will not make this visible, and I will keep it to myself and use it also, apparently. But, you know, and there's an interesting kind of dilemma there, right? Where you are effectively kind of letting the people who know these things, people who have the resources to do these things, the people who have resources to staff for these things, to only do these things, in fact, you're giving them kind of, in some ways, a monopoly on doing bad things, and so on. And this ends up being like, oh, well, it will just be done behind closed doors. And that's an interesting idea, opening Pandora's box and saying, well, if we all know about this, maybe we can, for example, I don't know. It feels foolish to say we can regulate stuff like this, but at the same time, there is an interesting kind of, if we have it out in the open, maybe we can actually do something about it. Or maybe at least we can form some consensus that this is wrong. That could be an idea. Have you seen any kind of, has there been any backlash from making this post, or has there been any positive development from making the post? Have you seen anything at all?
Not a lot of like backlash. There's been like some interest in it's like able to show fairly innocent correlations between websites, and a lot of people are finding that very interesting. You're able to like, if you enter like some blog, then you will find a bunch more blogs. I think mostly like the ethical implications of this have been mostly ignored. Maybe we're so used to like being spied on and analyzed that it just doesn't have an impact. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a very interesting point to be made about maybe we are so desensitized to a lot of these things that it doesn't really come up. We're more interested in the technical side because it's easier to sort of, it's easier to kind of be numb in the ethical area and just be like, oh, this is so cool though. Like, the technical side of this is really neat. There's a discussion
I also
there.
think there's possibly like a sense of just helplessness that like big tech is doing whatever they're doing and we can't really change it, so why bother?
Yeah.
Which is possibly a bit unfortunate. I think at least one of the things I'm trying to show with like in the broader sense with my projects is that, well, actually you can participate in the internet and you can build services, and sometimes they're pretty cool. But it's like we've forgotten that this is possible, and we're just leaving it to Facebook and Google and all those guys to do all of the innovation.
Yeah. Have you? Has this sort of been a cornerstone in why you write a lot? Because you spend probably a fair amount of time, I would guess, trying to articulate effectively, either it could be technical sides of the development process, it could be just ethical dilemmas, it could be it is surprisingly easy to write a search engine, guys. You should just know that, hey, this hasn't been as hard or whatever. Like, has this been a cornerstone of everything, like that you wanted to transmit these ideas to people and musings, or is it more of a side effect of just doing stuff and wanting to talk about something?
Yeah, I've always liked writing, so I'm just doing it almost whatever I'm doing. But there is some sort of itch to communicate these things, and not just like about the search engine, but about development practices and all of the stuff we've already talked about. Like,
right.
I feel there's a lot of nuanced discussion that's missing in this space, and talking about it or demonstrating what's possible is making a difference. Then that's fantastic.
Would you encourage people to build a search engine?
Well, if they think it's an interesting problem, they should definitely try.
Right.
I love the problem space because it's like no matter where you look, you will find interesting problems in language processing or in like constructing indexing software and so on. You're going. It's high and it's low, and there's like protocol level stuff, and then there's low level bit twiddling, and there's almost like no aspect of computer science or programming that isn't involved in some sense.
Right.
So it's like an obstacle course for problem solving, I think. And it should be noted, like a lot of my solutions they're incredibly stupid, and they're like the dumbest they can be while still working, and that's generally how I approach this sort of a problem. I put a skeleton in place that does the bare minimum, and then I improve it, and then I iterate until it's capable.
Right. I was going to ask, is this a guiding kind of principle, guiding light, like this idea of what is the simplest thing that could possibly work here?
Yeah. I think in general, when you're approaching something like this big, you need to have something in place as early as possible that you can iterate on, and then just keep working on it, because when you're approaching a new problem domain, you won't have the domain understanding to like top-down design anything that's useful. All your guesses will be wrong. So you need to do a bottom-up design as much as possible, and then you will basically assimilate domain understanding as you go, and then you can iterate and build something that's better.
Right. There's an interesting thing you said there. All your guesses will be wrong. And this actually touches on a thing that I kind of feel like you have expressed without expressing it in some ways. I think a lot of people would be surprised probably that this is the case. So there's a fairly recent post about actors, message queues, and so on that you've written where if I understand it correctly, you finally kind of automated the indexing of things to some degree, correct?
Yeah.
Right. And I think it would surprise a lot of people to hear that it took about 2 years for you to automate the indexing of things to some degree, right? How sort of accurate is that idea there, like, or the phrase, sort of?
Yeah. So like for the first 2 years, all of the processing was me logging into the server and typing a shell command and then waiting for a week and then logging in and running some other command and then doing some database stuff. And I had like a run book of stuff I used to do.
Right.
And this is how it's been for a very long time. And I think initially it's beneficial to have very low degree of automation because it allows a lot of flexibility in dealing with errors. Like if something goes wrong in step 2 out of 5, and these processes have several days worth of runtimes, then you can just eyeball the solution. Okay, I need to modify the code, or okay, I need to do this.
Right.
But if you have this stuff automated and you have like a crawling, processing, loading cycle that's 3 weeks or something. I think it was toward the end of the life of my previous server, and this goes wrong in week 2, and it can really sort of spiral out of control and start to hammer servers with crawling requests and so on. So in some sense, like having low automation allowed me to be very flexible in dealing with errors. But it's come to a point where this isn't really feasible anymore. But
right.
It took a surprisingly long time to get there.
Right. You had to grow into automating it, right? Instead of saying, oh, well, all of this should obviously be automated, like from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right? I think that there's again, it comes back to this, we talked about industry best practices and all of those things, right? A lot of those are prematurely adding something or making a system out of something where a system doesn't necessarily need to exist yet, and so on, right? And I think this one is interesting because it's closely related to the idea of future proofing and stuff like this, right? Where what you'll find oftentimes is a lot of programmers will say, well, we're definitely going to need this, or this should definitely be like this, so we're going to write the code to do that, and that actually takes 2 hours more than implementing the thing we needed right now took, right? And so on. And do you feel like, is this something you apply, this thinking of, oh no, we're going to get to that point and then I'm going to do this? Do you do this consciously, or is it more of a, or first of all, do you do this? I should ask. I don't want to put words in your mouth here. And if you do, is it conscious, or is it more of a, you've learned that this is just a way of things? Don't do things until they're actually needed, and so on.
Yeah, I think possibly it's a bit unconscious. I do this, but it's also like a property of the scale of the project. Because like there's always more stuff to do, and you need to like keep the change sane. Otherwise, you can drill down in some individual part like infinitely long, and you probably not get all that much better results. So I think there's like, in general, whatever you're doing, there's diminishing returns, right?
Right.
So if you build a stupid algorithm, that may get you like 80% of the way to a smart algorithm, and maybe you could leave this 80% algorithm in place for a while, or this like non-automation or whatever, to make it so that you can get to building a 80% algorithm somewhere else that currently has like a 5% algorithm that you just put together.
Right.
So there's like a constant process of revisiting all of these things and reevaluating decisions and so on. And to get back to what I was saying earlier, like when you start out on a large project, if you haven't built an internet search engine before, which I think most of us haven't, and possibly even if you have, you won't have like the intuitions and the domain understanding to make sound judgments about, well, how much do I need to do this, and what's the appropriate scale for a database of links or whatever. Even if you do like napkin math, it usually doesn't quite add up, and it's easy to over-engineer stuff as well. I think this is like one category pitfalls for search engine projects is to like think, hey, this is the Manhattan Project, right? We should like hire a bunch of people and they should like attack every angle and over-engineer everything, and then the project runs out of money and nothing comes of it. And there's been a bunch of these like attempts to for example compete with Google or something, coming from people with a lot of resources. They want the outcome, so they throw money at it, and then they get something that's over-engineered and doesn't perform very well.
Right.
I think the way to in general, I think most complicated software was usually built by one or two people, like iterating on it a bunch, and it's difficult to like throw staff and money at a problem that's properly hard. It usually doesn't pan out.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, there is this. It's a law, but it's not really a law. That I think states something like a working system invariably has spawned from a simple system, and so on, and a working system can never arise from a complicated system, and so on. Again, not really a law, but we tend to call things laws in software, regardless of how much of a law they are.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is interesting, right? Because maybe in some ways, if we derive from, what we talked about in this particular case here, maybe the next working, actually functioning search engine for people has to be made by one person in some ways, or a very small team of people. Is in some ways, would it be fair to say that you believe so?
Yeah, possibly. I think there's also something to be said for like burn rates and so on. Since this is a solo project for me, and the project expenses are my rent and food basically, and
Right.
since I'm owning the server and I'm co-locating, I have like a co-location bill of the equivalent of $100 a month, and this is what it costs to operate this search engine. Yeah, so this is if you approach it by building a small data center and then hiring 100 people, you will run out of money a lot quicker than I will.
Yeah. And
so that permits me to be a lot more experimental as well, and take risks in a way that I don't think you can do if you have a budget that's as harsh as you're going to have if you're a larger project.
Right. There's an interesting parallel here, right? Where I want to run this by you and see how much this kind of rings a bell. We're talking about budgets, right? And in some ways, there's a performance budget as well, right? I know that, I suspect at least, you might be able to confirm this, you do care about performance quite a lot, correct? This is my impression from Hacker News posts is what I should tell everyone. This is just that's the context I have here, just so everyone is aware. I've seen you talk obviously a lot about things that we wouldn't traditionally necessarily talk about when we are using higher level languages. That sort of we're using GC and so on. But you talk about memory locality being effectively, let's say, nice to the CPU and so on. We want patterns of access that are good for the CPU when we traverse large data sets. Obviously, you have massive data sets and so on. is this something where you feel like, because my intuition here is that because you spend that time, right, that allows you to add, for example, more steps. That allows you to add more heuristics. It allows you to, add modifications because your budget is made up out of the energy you spend effectively saying this has to be this way so that it's fast. Now we have the budget to do these things and so on. Is this a fair kind of assessment of this? Is this why you do the performance kind of oriented work, or how do you relate to this on a larger level?
Yeah, I think this is a relatively fair assessment. Since I'm on fixed hardware, I have a finite amount of compute resources, right? And so it's a matter of how can I use them well. And there's a lot of, like, you hear statements from developers like, well, this is cheap, compute is cheap, hardware is cheap, so let's not worry too much about performance. Maybe we can optimize later. This isn't really true in the domain I'm operating with a fixed set of hardware, where, like, I can't afford to buy another server, and running this on the cloud would be hilariously expensive. So I'm having to make do with what I have, and this means that I always have to be smart about how I use the hardware and always be optimizing what I'm doing. And this, I mean, it's a process of finding which corners to cut in many ways as well. Like, can I skip doing this processing step, and can I do this algorithm a bit dumber for the price of making it 5 times faster? But I also think in general, like, this is also a pedagogical point. Like, if I can, especially back when I was running this on a PC, and it's not significantly slower now than I'm on a proper server. But back when I was running this on a PC, I wanted to show people, actually, this is what a computer is capable of. So why is your, like, blog taking half a second to load?
Right.
I'm running a search engine on smaller hardware. To sort of demonstrate the paradox of why, also, computers have gotten faster, like, the last 30 years, but software seems to be getting slower. I couldn't wrap my head around this, right? And I wanted to viscerally show people that something is messed up here. We're doing something stupid. This shouldn't be the case. Like, if you open, like, a word processor on a modern computer, it's usually a bit slower than what you got on like a Windows 3.1 computer or something like that.
Yeah.
Now you have cloud connections instead of a floppy drive making noises, but it's still, like, surprisingly slow, everything.
Indeed. Is this?
Yeah.
So I'm getting a sense here that this is a general feeling that you have about software, like, just in general. Why are things so slow, and so on? Is this fair to say?
Yeah, this is just a general frustration point for me. Like, I can't understand why things are the way they are, and obviously I can understand that the reason everything is slow is that we're like on top of a pyramid of libraries upon libraries upon libraries and high level language and so on.
Yeah.
And we're very far away from the hardware, and sometimes we're, like, running on a VM, and then we're doing stuff in a library on top of the VM, and then we're doing it. Yeah. So, I mean, on some level, obviously, I understand why things are slow, but I don't understand why they have to be slow.
Right. Yeah. I'll be honest. I don't have anything particularly insightful to add to this. I think we're quite a few people who feel the same way. Most of us have elected to scream into the void, but you have elected to make a search engine on consumer hardware.
I've elected to make the slow software look bad by doing fast things instead.
Yeah, and I think we all want to do that, but we're not always, let's say, we haven't found our search engine yet, I guess. Not all of us, but yeah, that's an interesting kind of thing. You obviously, you said before, just old man, right? Screaming at cloud, right? Yeah. Do you feel old in computing? Obviously, you're not old, but do you feel in some ways like this cranky old guy who is upset at things?
Yeah, but I've always felt old. Like I was 17 years old, I felt like an old man. That's just my personality. But yeah, I think things are moving very quickly in development in general, and I don't think they're advancing quickly, but I think they're changing. So things that were valid 2 years ago aren't valid anymore.
Right.
But the things that have replaced them aren't necessarily better either. So there's like a lot of churn in modern development that
right.
And like I don't know if you mentioned it, but this search engine, it's built on Java, and one of the reasons I'm working on Java is because it's a super conservative language. That's like there are minor changes, but the actual language is very stable, and I don't need to worry about like making modifications to my code because the libraries or the language changes. So yeah.
Yeah, so you decided. Yeah, sorry.
So like, there's a frustration point with a lot of the modern tools that you spend a lot of effort keeping up with them that isn't spent building stuff.
Right. Yeah, there's so much to learn continuously that you end up in a
and you aren't like actually gaining new knowledge. You're just learning new things to do the same things.
Yeah.
New ways of iterating over a loop or whatever. This doesn't feel like you've reached another level. It feels like you've learned a new version of a library.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. I mean, conservatively, I can say that this will resonate with the viewers. I would say. Of course. I gave you a little bit of context before we started talking about this, that the channel is dedicated primarily to talking about a language called Odin, which I will put it like this. Learning Odin has an end. That end is probably a few weeks away for most people. So regardless of, where they start. So I think we can all relate to this idea of simply stopping, the learning of new things and just starting doing new things and learning concepts instead, and so on. So yeah, there was a comment on Hacker News once that I saw that you were discussing what makes software fast. I think you touched briefly on this before as well, and I will quote the relevant parts of these things. So. A poster says, I appreciate that this is a glass half full or empty kind of situation, but I tend to see quote unquote fast setups actually simply not doing a bunch of the mostly unnecessary stuff that other solutions are doing. And you responded to this by, saying, yeah, this is definitely true for Marginalia. It does exactly what it needs to do to serve the page and very little else. There's also no superfluous scripts in the front end, no session cookie, no user tracking. That stuff does add up. Then let's touch on this first part of that response first. First of all, I'm assuming this is still true for Marginalia. Otherwise it would be unfortunate.
Yeah. I have like maybe 100 lines of JavaScript running to get like a suggestions box and a few other things, but it's very minimal, and it's all like handwritten, and there's no libraries or NPM or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
it's true.
And then there's an interesting part. I want to know kind of the backstory, the context behind the second part. Many applications do so many redundant calculations, it's almost absurd. Professionally, I've seen many applications do enormous ORM lookups that fetch thousands of objects, stick them into a hash table by some key, and pick one value and compare against some parameter, and then do this operation in 4 different places in processing a single request. Gee, I wonder why we have 800 MS page loads. This seems very specific. Is there a story here?
The story is that I worked in enterprise Java, so that's basically the end of the story among like large legacy projects.
Right. Okay. So it's not one in particular necessarily. It's an industry.
No, it's an industry.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because in reading this post, I get the obvious sense of, I mean, this has happened literally. We're not talking hypotheticals. We are indeed talking about an actual thing that has been observed, right?
Yeah. And I have very a large number of horror stories from that world. So, maybe I shouldn't go into them. No.
I think at some point we risk the impression that we are indeed 2 old people just talking about how software sucks, and working with it is the worst thing ever. But yeah, this is an interesting, viewpoint. I think the industry at large, do you see any way that we could have something different, let's say, than the scenario we've kind of laid out here? Because I suspect that many people who have actually worked with software will recognize themselves in the sentiment of, why, guys? Like, why are we like this? Do you feel like there's any hope for the industry? Because of course, like, there's stuff here that is involved, that there are externalities, let's call it, right? There's the business pressure, there, features. There's the money really only supports features. It doesn't necessarily support good software, because we don't really have good software. No one can look at that and say, but why are they so good and they are so bad, right? As consumers, we tend to essentially just choose between 2 bad things in most areas, maybe 3. Do you see any hope? Like, is there any hope for an industry that sort of is where we are at currently?
I think that's a tricky question. On some level, and the reason why software sucks is that like applications suck in some sense. If you're trying to build a GUI for something, it's tremendously time consuming, and you end up having to like route all this data in awkward ways, and I don't know if there's a good answer to this, but I think it's the reason why we keep having these web frameworks. There doesn't seem to be a good answer, so people keep trying to invent solutions that don't work.
Right.
But yeah, it's a tricky problem, because there's like this paradox. If you say that method A works better than what the rest of the industry is doing, or programming language or whatever, we would expect to see like someone applying this method win out, right? Maybe if the hypothesis is that Haskell is better than other languages and has fewer bugs, and well, why aren't we seeing like that one Haskell shop like snowball and take over the world?
Yeah.
And this goes for what I'm preaching as well. Why, if things are this simple to fix, why aren't they solving the problem? So,
well,
I mean, you can come up with a bunch of explanations, but it's still a paradox, right?
Yeah.
Should
I get what you're saying, right?
To see.
We should see an existence proof of most things that are argued to be good. The existence of a thing should be the thing we need to say, oh, hang on, definitely that is what we should all be doing because it is better, right?
Yeah.
I wonder.
I just wanted to add that I think the way to escape this world of boring software is to build interesting software instead, and like try to build new things instead of building yet another web application for note keeping or whatever people are doing. Because since hardware has gotten faster, you can do new and interesting things that weren't available in the past.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, or the same thing where you can do these things now, not a company only, right? Because there are obviously these areas where certainly a company could do them before, but we are actually in a world now where you can actually do these because they are actually executable on the hardware you have. Certainly, someone's PC is good enough to do this thing. And of course, your space is interesting because there's so much data that RAM now suddenly becomes an actual factor. Because a lot of people's data sets for doing interesting things is on the order of 4 gigs or something like this, right? Where we can actually work with this very easily, right? And they can do a lot of interesting things, right? So most problem spaces would probably actually be even more accessible to people. It's simply the case that they don't know that they can do these things and how simple they can actually be in many ways, probably. You touched on an interesting thing there. The solution here is to simply do interesting things. And I wonder if you can combine this maybe potentially with another thing we talked about before. The solution is for small groups of people or maybe solo people even to do interesting things en masse. I wonder if that is maybe the solution to a lot of these things, because I have this naive perhaps idea that maybe there needs to be a counterweight to the idea that you have to have a big team. You have to have obviously a server farm. You have to have Kubernetes and all of these things, right? All of the things we've talked about effectively, right? The counterweight to all of this, right, is effectively the existence proof of small teams doing interesting and good things, right? If we look at these proofs actually exist in the wild. We just tend to either oversell them so that they become devalued. I would say one example of that would be Erlang is a part of WhatsApp's story, right? WhatsApp had on the order of 15 or so engineers working on the actual backend for the system, right? And that is probably 10 people too many, but whatever. I think there's an interesting kind of thing here where we hear these stories, right? But we don't really understand them always, right? And I think if we had more, we would see a pattern more clearly, right? But instead we see, of course, like VC-funded companies that hire 200 people almost immediately to do something that we can generously say would take 20 people, perhaps, right? And I wonder if maybe the solution is simply combine a few of these ideas that you have outlined here, where maybe the next best thing is going to come from some guy who decides to be audacious enough. Some person that says, well, a Raspberry Pi can surely run this. Maybe they're wrong, but they went there and they built the thing and they saw, hey, okay, maybe slightly more, but guys, you don't need a server farm to do this. Maybe this will actually bring us out of this industrial, let's say, pit that we find ourselves in. I wonder, like doing more things and saying, things are doable by one person. Things are doable by a small amount of people. You can move the, mountains, right? and fostering that kind of thinking. Maybe that's the solution, is kind of what I'm wondering.
Yeah, it's also important to keep in mind that like some Finnish barely out of teenage development, some Finnish guy built Linux back in the 90s, and like PC Unix was outdated and weird back then, but look at where we are now, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's a bit of a pitfall that some, especially younger developers, fall into nowadays. They're waiting for this perfect storm of ideological winds and conditions to set in before they actually start building something.
Right.
Which I don't think ever will happen. I think what happens is you build something and then people gather around it.
Yeah.
And then maybe it gains momentum, maybe, or it doesn't. But it certainly won't if you never start. And like writing manifestos about distributed search engines or whatever.
Yeah.
That's not going to snowball into something that exists in reality.
Right.
And there's also like there's also like sometimes you need to take risks, and I think a lot of development is very risk averse nowadays, even like in open source. Yeah.
Yeah, we're obviously also entering I would say, I suspect, at least, I'm not an economist. I suspect we are entering a period of even more conservatism in software development, certainly. Where juniors are not being hired, the seniors that are being hired they are very picky about them. New projects are probably not being done. Old projects are now being reinforced, only maintained, and so on. I suspect we're gonna have a tough time in the coming years. There was an interesting thing that you kind of did in talking about, obviously, the creation of Linux and Linus Torvalds and so on. You called him some Finnish guy, and this actually leads me to an interesting idea, concept perhaps, anti-concept. We tend to idolize a lot in software development. We probably pretend not to, but I have been, I've certainly said, referred to John Carmack as, God a few times. And there's an interesting thing that happens when you do this, right? You are effectively saying some people are beyond what mere mortals can be, and so on. And I wonder, maybe, do you have a feeling that, how do you feel about this? Would it be beneficial for us all to instead basically ground these people? Not necessarily like we don't have to, obviously interact with them in bad ways or whatever. I'm saying, because I wonder now, have I perpetuated this idea that normal people cannot make Doom, right? Or Quake? Because that would be false. I believe that there are multiple people in my audience. In fact, most of them could actually implement Quake, right? And so now I wonder, is there a point to trying to maybe change some of how we talk about people in the field? Do you think?
I actually think it's good to have role models and like people who are like elevating people who are actually doing things, but I don't think we should elevate them too high either. But there's something that Andreas, who's like the Serenity OS guy, he keeps talking about how if you never tackle difficult problems, then you will never get practice, and then you will never be able to solve them.
Right.
So seeing people solve difficult problems or like embark on audacious projects and possibly succeeding, it could be inspirational. I don't think it should be like, well, these people have clearly they're made of some different material. We can't really approach that. And there's like also this toxic notion that we should leave the difficult problems to the smart people,
right?
And just basically glue libraries together. I think that's self-perpetuating. If you tell yourself that you're not able to solve difficult problems, then you will never be able to solve difficult problems, because you will never try and never learn.
Right. Would you say this is a... Yeah, sorry.
Yes, yeah. What I was getting into is like, it can be a negative to elevate these guys too high, but I think we need to show people, especially today, that you can do stuff, and you can innovate, and you can build stuff, and maybe we shouldn't deify these guys, but I think it's important to have visibility that actually most of these people are people, and they're able to do all these things, and the question should be, how can I also do these things, rather than...
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess in some ways, to kind of put words to that, you have to make sure that this is something people aspire to, because aspiration implies that it's doable, right? Whereas reverence does not necessarily imply that, oh, I can definitely make the things that this person is making, and so on, or equal things and so on. So you kind of touched on something. What would you say to someone who's learning programming? In terms of, it doesn't have to be obviously like the final advice they will receive, and they should be able to then construct their own career out of this. But are there any key points that you would like to kind of stress for people who are learning?
Well, I don't know if I have any excellent advice for beginner programmers. The problem is I started learning programming when I was like 7 years old or something, and I was like coding in BASIC, and then I've been learning since then. So I don't have like it's difficult to me to put myself in the shoes of a beginner, because I haven't been a beginner for a very long time.
Right.
But I think, I mean, just keeping things simple and not overcomplicating things, which is advice that's good for beginners, but it's dangerous to internalize, because at the same time you see a lot of like experienced programmers who have internalized this advice, who still avoid difficult problems and still try not to overreach, and still try to like build things below their level. Yeah, so I don't know if I have any excellent advice for beginners, actually.
Right. Okay. So if we had to kind of at least distill something here, it would be, don't try to be simple in what you do, but rather how you do it.
Yeah.
So like aspire, make interesting things, but be aware that probably the solution that is the best for, now and for the foreseeable future might be simpler than you can see right now, and so on. Because I think we've all seen in the industry someone who is maybe less experienced, or you end up looking at their code and saying, I don't think this needs this many steps, perhaps, and so on. And that is the how of putting things together, making things right. But we're still working on the same problem together, of course, right? We're doing something that is moving the either wallets or technical excellence here forward. Something is expanding based on what we're doing, right? And so on. But yeah, it is an interesting problem. This I have also been asked, what would I say to new people, and so on. And I suspect the answer is what everyone else is saying. I'm not entirely sure. Certainly, I know a lot of people who are not saying these things, but that's because they have something to sell. I think generally, and I do not. I usually advise people to focus on learning concepts and so on, instead of frameworks and that kind of thing, because I tend to think it's probably the more useful thing at the end. But yeah, again, this is I learned programming, I don't know, 20 plus years ago. So I am in the same boat as you, where I feel like I don't even really remember. And honestly, I was also a very bad learner. So I don't know that I should be giving advice necessarily. I certainly spent a few years not becoming a lot better. So yeah.
Yeah, and as we talked about earlier as well, like a lot has changed since I learned programming. Like maybe my advice should be lock yourself into a closet with KNR and demand pages and go.
Yeah.
No internet connection.
Yeah, it's obviously, I mean, it's very easy to give advice that honestly no one can verify the actual efficacy of, I think.
Yeah.
And my only solace in this respect is that in some ways it is also very hard to prove that it's much worse than anyone else, and I don't know that you really can, right? My best guess is certain things and so on. I do still believe that the advice to don't necessarily learn frameworks, I think it's sound advice, but what do I have as a basis of this? Not really all that much, right? So I think it's a difficult question in the end, right? The landscape is difficult as well when a lot of people are getting into it for a career, and that's obviously a whole other kind of landscape. Like I can't actually tell people like, oh, well, learn the things I know. No, career-wise, that might be very difficult. They've worked out very well for me, but they're very niche things and so on. So it's very difficult to suggest someone to learn Erlang as an example of that. They're not going to necessarily just go out and find a job writing Erlang. It can be a little bit difficult, right? So, yeah.
I think possibly one piece of advice is to just follow your interests, because if you try to learn what other people are telling you to learn, it very rapidly turns into a chore, and you're not very interested in doing this stuff. Maybe they're telling you to do web frameworks, but you don't want to do that. You want to do network programming or something. It's very easy to end up on a path that doesn't lead you to where you want to go if you don't follow your interests. And it can be valid to end up somewhere else than other people. You can still usually make a career out of it, because then you have some unique insight into whatever you've mastered. So maybe that should be the advice to listen to, like follow your interests.
All right. Yeah, that's good advice.
That's how you get very deep understanding.
Yeah. So we're approaching the end here, and I want to give you kind of a chance here to perhaps, what is next for Marginalia? What is the plan? Do we have anything super interesting coming on the horizon, or is it just more of the goodness that we have? Like, what are we looking at?
Right. So I have had a goal to get to 1 billion documents for a long time, and so that's what I'm working on right now, and basically trying to scale this up to be able to find more stuff. Hopefully sometime next year I will reach that benchmark. To give some context, the beginning of the current year was at 50 million, and then at 100 million, and now I'm at 250 million. So it's growing, and since I very very recently moved to a new server, then hopefully I will be able to make it. But it's a difficult problem, just scaling up the set of websites you're crawling as well. So. And beyond that, I don't know. I'm always finding new things to improve, and like gaining insights into the problem space. Actually, I should be doing this instead. Yeah.
Right. Is the future of Marginalia looking good? What's your prognosis?
Yeah, well, as good as it can look in this economy, I think. But
right.
the happy news is that I'm grant funded, and I have money to live off like a couple of years at least, so I can do this full time.
Right, so we're safe for a few years in any case.
Yeah, hopefully, and if I haven't made a bigger splash by then maybe I shouldn't get another job. Maybe. Thankfully, it's probably a good thing to have a search engine on your resume, so I will probably make it if it doesn't work out. It's certainly a unique resume.
I suspect it's quite the draw. There's another discussion to be had whether, you know, what that can actually lead to and so on and so forth, if you really want to go from making a search engine to working on let's say the industry's problems again. That's obviously, you know, maybe that's not necessarily a move you want to be making, but I suspect that you can probably draw in interesting places with this resume still.
Yeah.
So yeah, with all of that said, it was super nice talking to you here, and so on. I think this will be a very interesting conversation for people to hear, that you can in fact make a search engine on your own, and so on. I'm going to be putting some resources of the blog posts we've been talking about and so on in the description for everyone to see, and so on. And I would love for Viktor to also kind of fill in like maybe some, you know, possible resources that could be used, or interesting posts that he has that he wants to kind of share with people who are interested in maybe the technical side of this, so they can consume this on their own schedule and so on. But yeah, it was nice having you. Yeah.
It's my favorite topic to talk about, so I can go all day.
As usual, I want to thank our channel patrons. On Hex 8, that's Jeff Ward, Matthew Cruz, Pavlin Nedelchev, and Alex Ragali. Hex 4, that's Ed Yu, Znanie, Valentina Tanasov. Hex 2, that's Dimitros Sereda, Mikhail Dobrev, and Nonlinear. I want to thank you guys for showing your appreciation. A lot of this stuff becomes easier, of course, with this level of interaction and so on. Thank you guys so much. Ciao.